Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with the latest presidential assassination attempt last night at the same site where 40 years ago President Reagan was shot. We'll discuss how a bipartisan gathering to celebrate the First Amendment turned into yet another example of how the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Second Amendment is failing us. Joining us is Adele Stan, an independent journalist and longtime chronicler of the right wing of U.S. politics, a winner of the Hillman Prize in Opinion Analysis Journalism. Her work has appeared in Mother Jones, The Nation, The American Prospect, as well as on the op-ed pages of the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times. Then we'll assess the latest diplomatic dance without a partner as Trump cancels Witkoff and Kushner's latest planned trip for talks to Pakistan to meet nobody at the table, since the Iranian foreign minister had already left and Iran had no plans to send another delegation. Joining us is Matthew Petti, an assistant editor at Reason magazine, who has recently reported for the BBC in Persian and English, The Intercept, The Daily Beast, New Lines magazine, Responsible Statecraft, Middle East Eye, and The National Interest, among other publications. He covers U.S. national security policy and its interactions with American society and domestic politics, and his latest articles at Reason include Neither War Nor Peace with Iran, and Trump's Iran deal looks a lot like the previous ones he hated. Then finally we'll speak with Alfred McCoy, who holds the Harrington Chair in History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and is the author of 24 books, including The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, In the Shadows of the American Century, and To Govern the Globe. His latest book is Cold War on 5 Continents, A Global History of Empire and Espionage, and we will discuss his article at Tom Dispatch, Trump's Iran War is exactly the kind of military misadventure that ends empires. And before we begin with Trump having bombed 7 countries and started a war against Iran, while at home his ICE thugs terrorize and break up families, murdering American citizens in the process, the need to rid the country of the deeply unpopular Trump kakistocracy and his clown car cabinet could not be more urgent. But these crooks and criminals would do anything to stay in power, as their billionaire buddies buy up the mainstream media and the mob boss intimidates Republican politicians. Only people power can beat money power, and we need all hands on deck as we continue to do our part, delivering a daily public service, providing the facts and evidence to inform the majority of what they are up against and how to win back our country, our decency, and the respect of the community of nations. You can help save America's 250-year-old democracy by making a tax-deductible donation at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org, and thank you. And joining us now is Adele Stan, an independent journalist and longtime chronicler of the right wing of U.S. politics, a winner of the Hillman Prize in Opinion and Analysis Journalism. Her work has appeared in Mother Jones, The Nation, and the American Prospect, as well as on the op-ed pages of the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times. Welcome to Background Briefing, Adele Stan.
Great to be with you, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And we have to go back a couple of days before last night's White House Press Association's annual correspondence dinner, at which an assassination attempt was made on President Trump. The assassin did not get into the ballroom, but he came pretty close, and there was a major shootout with Secret Service, and we all saw how the president was evacuated by the Secret Service, and everybody had to get under the tables, and it was pretty dramatic. So before we get to that, let's go back a couple of days till Thursday, when there was an intimate dinner hosted by David Ellison, who has just bought Warner Brothers, which also owns CNN, and he's waiting for White House approval on that $111 billion deal. The dinner was at what used to be called the U.S. Institute of Peace. It's now been renamed as the Donald J. Trump Institute of Peace, which is somewhat Orwellian given what's going on in Iran. But nevertheless, at the Trump table at this lavish dinner, you had Barry Weiss, the Trump's and the Ellisons, and then you had all of the CBS News people, including Wei Zhejiang, who is also the head of the White House Correspondents Association, and she was the MC last night at the event that ended up being cancelled. And then, of course, she also got to ask the first question at the impromptu press conference that was held in the White House about 30 minutes after the shooting. And she got to ask this incredibly softball question, which is, how did you feel at the time? Which is, you
Right.
often have, when a reporter asks some, desperate woman, how do you feel now that you've learned that your husband has murdered all of your children?
Right.
So, so so there's a thread there. It
Mm,
would seem to me that when you celebrate the First Amendment, which the Trump administration was telling us this was all about,
right.
this is not celebrating the First Amendment. This is celebrating an oligarch taking over the media, where the once adversarial CBS News is now completely in your pocket.
Hmm.
And you don't like comedians. You can't stand comedians like Colbert, who CBS fired, one of their most popular programs, because he makes fun of you. So
Right.
instead, you get them, the Ellisons and Barry Weiss and Wei Zhejiang, to change the whole thing. And instead of having a comedian, you have a mentalist, whatever the hell that is. And the fix was already in before this thing started.
Oh, completely. I mean, um, you know, thank you for bringing us back to that Thursday dinner because that is so absurd. Larry and David Ellison own CBS News, and now they're going to own CNN as well. But they own CBS News, and they had this special dinner with these reporters who ostensibly cover Trump at this private dinner that was not on the record, right? And chummy, chummy, chummy. And it was so interesting last night, before all the mayhem took place. C-SPAN did this kind of really sad take on a red carpet because, like, Washington fashion is like not fashion. Um, but they're doing this red carpet type thing, and they talked to Doug Bergen, who is the Secretary of the Interior, and ask him whose table he's sitting at because you have to be invited by a media organization. Even if you are, a government official, you have to be invited by a media organization to attend this dinner. And Berg proudly says Paramount, Skydance, which are the people who own CBS News and just bought Warner Brothers, right? I mean, it's just you can't make it up. And also, I thought it was charming that Scott Bessent, the Secretary of the Treasury, who just lies to us on the regular, was invited by the New York Post, which he said was his favorite newspaper, which is, of course, owned by Rupert Murdoch. But anyway, yes, this whole thing about and that is so-called a celebration of the First Amendment, and the guest of honor is the first president we've ever had who just forthrightly kind of, defies the First Amendment. As far as the mentalist goes, there's a personality on Blue Sky, the social media app, named Hoodlum, who said, wrote, I'm starting to think that the mentalist they hired was a fraud because, of course, he didn't predict that this was going to happen. He's supposed to read people's minds. So it
Oh,
was
I see.
all,
So he,
yeah.
he didn't predict the assassin, right?
No, apparently not. And, another thing that's not being reported, Ian, is, being an obsessive nerd, I watched every video angle I could find, and Getty, who were there really for still photography, caught an angle from the wings of the stage of Trump being ushered out, and he fell flat on his face. Trump fell right down, and Weijia Jiang was behind him, helping to pick him up. It was, I mean, Melania was long gone, and so was JD Vance, but Trump fell flat on his face. And the whole thing was just really crazy. And as close as we keep hearing the gunman was, he was really a floor away from the entrance to the ballroom. So there's also just a lot of confusion in the reporting. Last night we heard that the gunman had not fired off a shot. Now they're saying he did. And then there was a bartender from the event told Politico that the gunman fired a shot before he rushed the perimeter, the magnetometers. So it's really still very confusing about what exactly happened in the moment.
Well, Trump himself released the picture, the video of the gunman running
Right.
past all of the Secret Service detail up to the magnetometer. So he was able to control the whole press conference,
Yes.
the way the spin is, make it all seem so cozy and bipartisan, and a celebration of the First Amendment.
Hmm.
He also got to plug Todd Blanche as the Attorney General. I think
Right.
that's so clearly a done deal that we're going to end up with that crooked scumbag who's worse than the one that was just fired. I
Yeah.
mean, I mean,
Well, let's see. Well, see if he gets confirmed. I mean, he may have a little trouble with Republicans as well. I don't know.
why? What do you have any inkling who might oppose him? And they're not famous for standing up to Trump.
No, but I think a few of the people who voted, I mean, they're going to have to answer for voting to release the Epstein files. All those Republicans who voted to release the Epstein files in the Senate, being challenged on that. I mean, I think it will be messy. Maybe he'll get confirmed anyway, but it's going to be messy.
Well, the most of the coverage was, of course, sympathetic, and obviously, it happens too often,
Absolutely.
and it also was 40 years ago in the very same spot. Ronald Reagan was shot
Hmm.
by Hinckley, so this happens all the time, and it is a little ironic that a celebration of the First Amendment ends up being a test of how much the Supreme Court completely destroyed the Second Amendment and
Right.
perverted it, and how the country's awash with guns. And
Hmm.
this character from Torrance here in Los Angeles, Cole Thomas Allen, 31, he apparently took a train from L.A. to Chicago and then another one from Chicago to Washington, D.C. Presumably, he was able to take the guns aboard the train and
Yes.
then book into the Hilton Hotel, and he was just a customer. He was so the idea that they've been holding these events at a place where anybody can go in and out of is a bit of a security nightmare.
Absolutely. And, Carol Leonnig of MS Now last night was saying that the Secret Service folks, she had been talking to her sources, and she's a great investigative journalist, said that there had been no screenings done on the hotel guests. Like normally you would run their names and date of birth and social security numbers through a check, and that had not been done. But that probably wouldn't have stopped this guy because apparently he doesn't have a police record. And I do think that the train, I travel by train a lot, mostly Northeast Corridor. Between my parents were in the New York area and I'm from that area, but I live in DC, so I travel Amtrak a lot. And it has always astounded me that there's like no security check getting on one of those trains. And this guy must have spent some real dough, because I've been checking out that route just because I want to take a train across America someday. And I watched the fares. And I mean, he had to have spent at least $1,000 one way to get there. And it's also not cheap to get a room in the Washington Hilton. So, I mean, this was a very carefully planned, this seems to be a very carefully planned thing. Now, in terms of they're saying that it was, Blanche is saying, well, they believe he was out to get Trump and the people on the dais. Nobody knows that. He could have had a thing against the media, and knocked off a bunch of people in the media. I mean, we really don't know. The other question I have about it, one of the stills they show of him, after he had been tackled and handcuffed, He's naked. Was he streaking? I mean, did they strip him? How did that happen?
Well, they stripped him.
Yeah.
That's a way to neutralize somebody. But one of the things that I thought was extraordinary about the press conference conducted by Trump was that Trump made the point that only great presidents get shot at, like
Oh my.
him and Lincoln. And if you're a nobody like Joe Biden, I'm sure he's implying Joe Biden, he's obsessed with Joe Biden. Nobody wants to take a shot at you. I mean,
Yeah, he mentioned Lincoln and Kennedy. He somehow left out Jerry Ford. I don't know why.
he then got a plug in for the White House ballroom, saying that next time we could do it at the White House ballroom, where you'd have real security against drone attacks, et cetera, et cetera. So,
and he did that almost from the top of the of these press conference. I mean, that was like the kind of the first thing he went to was this ballroom, right? And not, not any kind of appreciation for whatever danger everybody else had been subjected to or any of it, just his ballroom. And the thing is, you would never have the White House press, you would hopefully not have the White House Correspondents Association dinner in the White House. The point is that it's the press, it's the adversarial press, right? You get invited to their event. It's not like you invite them to your event, if you're president. So
right. Well, it's a sad day, really, for the rest of the world to see how awash we are with guns, how the most powerful person in the land is a target for any lunatic with a gun.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And Trump, of course, tried to make jokes about the guy coming from California, equating Californians with lunatics.
Right, of course, always.
So, but here we are, raining down. Trump himself assassinated, along with Netanyahu, the leadership in Iran. So here we are talking about presidential assassination. Well, our president is an assassin.
Oh, absolutely. And complicit with all of the Israeli hits on journalists throughout Gaza and now in Lebanon. I mean, Netanyahu is a murderer of journalists, and Trump's his best buddy. I mean, it's just mind-blowing. And the other thing that troubles me about the whole thing is that because we've been lied to so much by this administration, nobody believes anything that is said, right? There's no kind of truth. So you have all these wild conspiracy theories going on now about whether or not this thing was staged and all of that. And that kind of unmooring from any factual record is really dangerous for the country. As you said, it's a sad day for our country, and it's also going to get sadder as all kinds of theories get extrapolated on all sides.
Yeah, there's lots of conspiracy theories about Butler, Pennsylvania, so there'll undoubtedly be a slew of them. I thank you for joining us, Adele. I appreciate it.
Always great to be with you, Ian. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And again, I've been speaking with Adele Stant, who's an independent journalist and longtime chronicler of the right wing of U.S. politics, a winner of the Hillman Prize in Opinion Analysis Journalism. Her work has appeared in Mother Jones, The Nation, The American Prospect, as well as on the op-ed pages of the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times. We're going to go to station break, back assessing the latest diplomatic dance without a partner as Trump cancels Witkoff and Kushner's latest planned trips for talks in Pakistan to meet nobody at the table, since the Iranian foreign minister had already left and Iran had no plans to send another delegation.
Last week I had the strangest dream, where everything was exactly how it seemed, where there was never any mystery of who shot John F. Kennedy. It was just a man with something to prove, slightly bored and severely confused. He steadied his rifle with his target in the center and became famous on that day in November.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Matthew Petti, an assistant editor at Reason Magazine, who has previously reported for the BBC in Persian and English, The Intercept, The Daily Beast, New Lines Magazine, Responsible Statecraft, Middle East Eye, and The National Interest, among other publications. He covers U.S. national security policy and his interactions with American society and domestic politics, and his latest articles at Reason include Neither War Nor Peace with Iran and Trump's Iran deal looks a lot like the previous ones he hated. Welcome to Background Briefing, Matthew Petti.
Thank you for having me on.
Well, thanks for joining us. And Iran's foreign minister went to Islamabad. Apparently, Witkoff and Kushner have been dispatched. As far as we know, on Saturday, the foreign minister of Iran left Islamabad for Oman, and then he's going on to Moscow. So what are Kushner and Witkoff going to be doing on Saturday in Islamabad?
So my understanding of this, and I'm just going off of public press reporting, I don't have any special sources, or I haven't talked to anybody recently about what's happening, but my understanding of what's happening is that they're basically doing indirect talks or a game of telephone through Pakistan, right? It's Pakistani officials are receiving the American proposal, telling it to the Iranian foreign minister, Araghchi, as he arrives. And then Araghchi has his own regional tour that he's been doing along with Pakistan, I guess running some kind of side missions or, because he went to Russia and Oman. And then the Americans get this message from the Pakistani side. And then, Araghchi will come back and it's sort of shuttle diplomacy, if you will. So that seems to be what's happening. This is obviously much slower than the direct negotiations that we saw earlier in the month with J.D. Vance and Baghar Ghalibaf, who are both high-ranking officials who are actually empowered to make these decisions. But we'll see. I mean, this is just sort of a game of telephone in Pakistan now.
So could this be described as the B team? In other words, the foreign minister, who doesn't seem to have a lot of clout, meeting with Kushner and Witkoff, whereas the A team would be Vice President Vance and Ghalibaf. Not that there's any plans of those two getting together. How would you characterize this particular team? Is it the B team?
Yes, I think the B team is a good way of putting it, and I think it's sort of they're still communicating and putting out feelers, but this is not intended to be the agreement. And I think there's been a little bit of exaggeration from the Trump administration of how divided the Iranian side is. I think this is a bit face-saving. The Iranian side has come out with pretty clear, stubborn demand, as a consensus. And so the Trump administration doesn't want to feel jilted, so they act like, oh, this is actually the result of internal disputes. But I think, yes, it is true, though, that with the Iranian system in flux, it would be more likely to get traction if you actually had a senior official go. And I think on the American side, Witkoff and Kushner in particular have sort of been very bad faith negotiators. They quite publicly, at the beginning of this war, they quite publicly showed disdain for discussing the details of the nuclear issue with Iran. And Witkoff went and publicly gave an interview that said, all we want to know is, will Iran surrender? And I think the Iranians have also said publicly that they think of Witkoff and Kushner not even entirely as representing the U.S. side, but sort of as representing Israeli interests. So I think all in all, Iran sending Araghchi and not even having him stay in the room, just having him pick up a message, and the U.S. sending Witkoff and Kushner is a sign that this is, the B team. This is a back burner. This is not, it's designed to urgently come up with credible solutions.
Well, you have to have some sympathy, I think, Matthew, for anybody working for Trump, because he's so mercurial and changes his mind all the time. But as far as we know, is he playing the good cop, bad cop with having the Secretary of Defense make all of these bellicose statements about locked and loaded? Is that a part of the play here? it doesn't seem to work. I don't know that you can intimidate the Iranian side. They don't seem to buckle under threats.
I mean, everybody eventually has their breaking point and their limit, and I think. But the thing is that the Iranian side has not reached it; it's not close to reaching it, and I think the U.S. is just not willing to pay the price because it's not worth it that necessary to make them buckle. I do think, as you said, the good cop, bad cop is a good way to look at it. Just like the Iranian side's internal divisions are exaggerated, I think the Trump administration's internal divisions and Trump's own sort of mercurial force of will, these things are also exaggerated. I think Trump does have, as you say, a good cop, bad cop strategy, a sort of madman theory. He thinks he can scare them. But I mean, it's sort of an empty threat unless you're willing to seriously follow through on the threat to escalate, which I think Iran is skeptical of that precisely because it would be so insane to, I don't know, launch a ground invasion of Iran or start a tit for tat war over power plants or something. I mean, that would just be forgetting the moral human cost. It would just be so incredibly damaging and soak up so many U.S. resources. I think Trump is sort of, everyone knows that Trump wants sort of an easy out for this war.
Well, the latest rumors of a military plan are that the U.S. wants to bombard and possibly send Marines ashore along the Iranian side of the Strait of Hormuz, not go to Kharg Island, which seems like a long shot. What are we to make of that? Because, I saw some of these talking head generals on cable TV talking about this scenario, saying how they think it's going to happen within 7 days and it's going to be hazardous, to put it mildly.
Yeah, it would be extremely hazardous. I mean, I think the U.S. military could take and hold territory inside Iran. I don't think it, I mean, I don't want to put these predictions, but I think it would be much easier to take and hold some territory in Iran than to march on Tehran. I think again, I think the cost would be staggering. I think it's something that Trump doesn't want to pay, but it's possible that they decide this is the only way to reopen Hormuz. And as you said, I think it makes a lot more sense than invading Kharg Island, which is just kind of a red herring. I mean, that's something that Trump's been obsessed with since the 80s. Is sort of, that's the key to the Iranian oil export system. Therefore, if we seize it, it'll sort of be the I win card. I mean, I think the generals probably, if he does decide to go for restart the war and go for a land invasion, I think the generals would probably tell him that it makes a lot more military sense to grab the entrance to the Iranian side of the Strait of Hormuz than to grab this island deep inside the Gulf that doesn't really have military value.
So, Matthew, given that you've reported for the BBC in Persian and English, it seems to me that the Iranian people are being sort of lost in the shuffle here. That, going back in January, there was rebellions against this government that brutally put down, killed 6,000, 7,000, 10, 20, 30, 40, who knows how many people were killed. The theory is, or the evidence seems to be, that the government was at its weakest at that point and behaved in such a brutal and paranoid way. But now we're getting reports that the hardliners are completely in control. Nobody can go out on the street without threat of being shot. So is this the real casualty of this war, have been the Iranian people?
Yeah, I mean, it is sort of, it was extremely cynical how the U.S. and Trump in particular kind of egged on this rebellion, saying help is on the way, and then, just use that as a pretext to start a war that at the end of the day was not going to help people, was designed to destroy Iranian society, but also he seemed pretty willing to do a Venezuela-style deal rather than go for regime change. And then I think you're putting the pin on it that a wartime society becomes more repressive. I think there's a few different reasons. One is that the government, which was already paranoid from being weak, now is sort of has its fears vindicated. I think you're right in that also it sort of internally within the elite sort of vindicates the most hawkish people. And I think war is also an extremely exhausting and demoralizing experience. Nobody is going to rise up against their government. Or I don't want to say nobody, this has happened in history, but this kind of all-out war against a society is not going to create space for people to rebel. I think, ironically, if the US had sort of stepped back and not done anything, then there is a good chance that this rebellion would have gone further and we could have seen a serious collapse in the Islamic Republic. But I think that Trump personally took the reins of this and said, help is on the way, wait for us, and then didn't do anything with it, and in fact pursued this war in a very demoralizing way for Iranians. I remember back in January and February, what people in Iran were telling me was, whether pro-government or anti-government or just sort of ordinary people, bystanders who wanted to know what the future would look like, everyone was just waiting to see what the US would do, which was definitely a new development. I mean, there have been a lot of uprisings in Iran over the past few years where it's an internal thing, and Iranians sort of understand they have to stand on their own 2 feet. And I mean, the anti-hijab law protests actually did accomplish a great deal. And I think this was different because people believed that by the end of it, that this was not an internal revolution, that this was going to summon outside help, that ended up not coming in a timely manner, and then when it came was extremely destructive.
Well, I don't know that there's any government worse than this government in terms of the way it treats its own people, slaughtering thousands in the streets. And when you think about how cruel and horrible the leadership, and particularly the Revolutionary Guard Corps, it makes you wonder whether, what would these guys do with a nuclear weapon? And they've got 1,000 pounds of highly enriched uranium at 60%, which you can make bombs out of that. So what's your sense about a government that kills its own people with such alacrity?
I mean, yeah, it's pretty brutal. I think nobody's denying that. We saw it sort of at its worst in January, and sort of how far it was willing to go when it was threatened. I don't think that means that they're sort of irrational. I mean, when you talk about nuclear weapon, I don't think that means that they're madmen. Like, North Korean government is extremely repressive, and yet their approach to the nuclear arsenal has been quite rational, and their repression and their nuclear aims actually come from the same desire to sort of, not end up like Gaddafi, to stay in power, not be killed by their own people or by external intervention, or by the combination of these two things, which is sort of what seems to them was materializing. But I think the nuclear issue is also a bit of a red herring, because Iran sort of never seriously pursued this kind of they did before 2002, but then for a while the nuclear program was just a bargaining chip. They really could have dashed for a bomb if they wanted to, and they never did until it was too late. And if we look at what was happening right before Trump attacked, they were negotiating their nuclear program, and they were looking to sort of trade parts of it away for what was ultimately something they cared a lot more about, the sort of end to economic embargo and guarantee against aggression. So I think the nuclear discussion is a bit of a red herring, and I think that Iranian stubbornness around the nuclear program, and also American insistence on sort of making it an international issue, are both sort of a cipher for the other issues between the two countries. And I think that the crisis started over a nuclear weapon, or over the Iranian nuclear program, because they basically needed a pretext to fight Iran over its other sort of issues. And I think that the crisis will end with a nuclear deal once both sides have sort of decided that they want to resolve those other issues. I don't know if this is making any sense, this explanation.
Well, we've told that the Supreme Leader who was killed on day one, that he had a fatwa against nuclear weapons, and that the theory has been that they've used the threat of nuclear weapons as a way to get other priorities like sanctions relief. So, do we have any guarantees that the son, Mustafa, who's apparently gravely wounded, he lost a leg and half another leg, and his face is all burned, and he may not be in very good shape. Isn't it likely that they'll have a much harder line and they won't have that religious injunction against nuclear weapons?
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. It could be that they decide that, I mean, it seems at the moment that this is the chip they're most willing to trade away, because it's been the most useless to them. It could be that if this conflict continues, they'll try to dig out the nuclear material and build a bomb. I think not just Mojtaba, but the entire sort of layer of leadership under him is a lot less cautious and more hawkish. It's sort of hardline, as you said, than before. So I do think that that is a risk, that they end up making a dash for a bomb. I just don't think it's like I don't think it's an immediate risk, because I think that they've realized they have other more valuable bargaining chips, such as Hormuz, such as threatening the Arab monarchies, the oil-rich Arab monarchies, that have been a lot more fruitful to them.
Well, that's just in closing what I wanted to ask you, because if they go ahead with this plan to send the Marines ashore and bombard the Iranian side of the Strait of Hormuz, we know that Iran will retaliate against the Saudis and the Kuwaitis and the Qataris and the UAE, etc. And then you could have a global recession / depression. So Trump is really playing with fire here, isn't he? I mean, do you think he knows it? Do you think he has any idea of how much the rest of the world is furious? Our allies in Europe and in Asia are furious with what Trump has done?
No, I think that Trump is in a very controlled information environment. I think the administration is hiding the extent of damage from Trump, economic damage. I think there's a fair bit of market manipulation, especially in financial markets like stocks and oil futures, which are a bit removed from the physical damage. And these are the indicators that Trump pays the most attention to. I mean, it really comes down to a question of how much of the global economy they're willing to sacrifice to avoid giving Iran concessions that would lose the US face. I think that if they wanted out of this crisis now, they could basically agree to some kind of non-aggression pact, and Iran would open up the Straits of Hormuz and something could be worked out. I think that the mentality of a lot of the administration is that, well, this damage is worth eating to finish off Iran once and for all. I mean, a lot of them have said so publicly, right? That, it's like temporary pain for long-term gain. I think they're wildly overconfident. And I think that they are probably keeping Trump in an information bubble, where they're overestimating the damage they're doing to Iran and downplaying the damage that's being done to the global economy, because they think that ultimately this is a price worth paying.
Well, Matthew Petti, thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you for having me.
And I've been speaking with Matthew Petti, an assistant editor at Reason magazine, who was previously reported for the BBC in Persian and English, The Intercept, The Daily Beast, New Lines magazine, Responsible Statecraft, Middle East Eye, and The National Interest, among other publications. He covers U.S. national security policy and its interactions with American society and domestic politics, and his latest articles at Reason include Neither War Nor Peace with Iran and Trump's Iran deal looks a lot like the previous ones he hated. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back speaking with historian Alfred McCoy about Trump's Iran war being exactly the kind of military misadventure that ends empires. Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Alfred McCoy, who holds the Harrington Chair in History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and is the author of 24 books, including The Politics of Heroin, In the Shadows of the American Century, and To Govern the Globe. His latest book is Cold War on Five Continents, A Global History of Empire and Espionage. And he has an article at Tom Dispatch, Trump's Iran War is exactly the kind of military misadventure that ends empires. Welcome to Background Briefing, Alfred McCoy.
Happy to be here. Happy to be here.
Thanks for joining us, Alan. Your latest article it goes back 2,500 years to ancient Athens and its disastrous Peloponnesian Wars, and then goes to Portugal in the 1400s, where they went on a fool's errand into Morocco and lost thousands of men. 8,000 Portuguese troops were killed, 15,000 captured, and only 100 escaped. And then in 1920, the Spanish military, and of course Franco was involved, pretty much did the same thing in Spanish Morocco, or what they wanted to. They went after the Berbers, and the Rif War was a complete catastrophe, and the Berbers slaughtered some 12,000 Spaniards. But I think the one historical analogy that fits what's happening now with the U.S. war on Iran is the 1956 Suez attack by the British and the French and the Israelis, which was the sort of death rattle of empire, and it had all kinds of incredibly negative consequences. And that was at a time when the U.S. had a president who was sort of Eisenhower, who didn't have much sympathy for the death rattle of European empires. So would you agree, Al, that the 56 of Suez is close to what we're doing now? In other words, we have become the French and the British, and of course, again, we're working with the Israelis, as they did in 56, and as Trump did with Netanyahu in the last few months.
Ian, to answer your question, yeah, the parallels between Great Britain in 1956 in Suez and the United States in 2026 in the Strait of Hormuz are almost eerily similar. It's strikingly, stunningly similar. So let me explain, first of all, the basis of the similarity, and then second, the overarching reason why history has not only rhymed, but seems to be repeating, okay? First of all, the similarity. In 1956, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, in a diplomatic dispute with Great Britain, decided that he would nationalize the Suez Canal. And this was the Britain's lifeline to the Persian Gulf oil fields, which it controlled on the south shore of the Persian Gulf. And more importantly, it struck a deep emotional chord in the British elite, the Conservative Party, which was and still is the oldest political party on the planet. It was the political party that largely built the British Empire. And as the pressures of decolonization, of the loss of India in 1947, and pressures on the empire built up, Britain became heavily invested in its position in the Middle East. It became, after the loss of India, the kind of epicenter of the British global empire. So when Nasser sees the Suez Canal, he sees the critical geopolitical choke point that held that whole structure together. And the prime minister of the day, Sir Anthony Eden, who was the son of a baronet, an aristocrat born to wealth and privilege, and an unstable personality, a mercurial personality, he was outraged. He convened a cabinet meeting at 4 a.m. when the news reached London of the canal seizure. He ordered MI6 to launch a series of bungled assassination attempts against Nasser. And he plotted with the French and the Israelis. And when I say plot, I mean it. They met in a secret safe house outside Paris, and they plotted a phase, invasion of the Suez Canal. In the first phase, 6 British and French aircraft carriers destroyed the Egyptian Air Force, shot down over 100 Egyptian jets. And in the sands of the Sinai Peninsula, the Israeli army, led by the dashing Moshe Dayan, destroyed most of Egypt's armor. And within the first week of war, Egypt was utterly helpless before the might of this awesome imperial juggernaut. It was totally, completely defeated. And then Nasser did something that was brilliant in its simplicity. He filled a couple of dozen rusting freighters with rocks and stones and sank them at the north end of the Suez Canal, so that by the time 20,000 French and British Rangers, commandos came storming ashore to seize the canal, it had been functionally snatched from their grasp. And it was a stunning geopolitical defeat that, with one twist, turned seeming victory into defeat. And in a couple of months, the British withdrew. And by the time they withdrew, the British pound sterling, which had once been the world's global reserve currency, required the first IMF bailout, not the Mexican peso, but the British pound, in order to save it from collapse. Britain had been reprimanded by the United Nations. The aura, the might, the majesty of British power had evaporated, and the British Empire was on a 10-year road to complete extinction. The parallels with the Straits of Hormuz and the contemporary conflict are similar. In the first week of war, the Israeli and U.S. Air Force utterly devastated Iran's air defenses so that the U.S. could switch to cheap dumb bombs, and not having to use smart missiles, smart bombs, which are very expensive. Basically, they destroyed the Iranian Navy, and they had total control over the air of Iran and could strike at will, and did tremendous damage to Iran's military infrastructure. And again, in the first week of war, it looked as if Iran was laying prostrate before the might of America's air-powered juggernaut. And again, there are only about 7 or 8 major maritime choke points on this planet. One was the Suez Canal, which Nasser played so brilliantly. The other is the Strait of Hormuz. And the Iranians fired off a bunch of their super cheap Shahed drones, cost about $20,000 a copy to make them, kind of the latter-day equivalent of a rusting freighter, if you will. And they hit 5 freighters in the Straits of Hormuz with these drones, and they closed the Straits of Hormuz. And again, this was a stunning geopolitical inversion. Iran went from utter defeat, prostrate before the might of American military power, our terrible swift air power sword. In one brilliant masterstroke, the Iranians had reversed the situation, and they're now holding the whip hand. And Trump is blustering. He's gone from demanding total surrender right at the beginning. Basically, he's looking for a way out of this geopolitical mess that he's caught himself in. And the consequences for the United States are very similar. In all of our past military operations since the end of World War II, we've had massive Allied support. All of our recent interventions in the Middle East have had a tremendous number of allies signing on board, lending troops and ships and aircraft to support us. And this time we have not a single ally. And as this third-tier power with a ravaged economy and a very troubled society, roiled by rioting and repression, that even when the United States confronts, but effectively as a third-tier military power, we're tactically brilliant, but strategically inept. We're strategically incapable, strategically impotent. And so what's going on here, Ian? So what it is that there is this phenomenon that historians have documented called micromilitarism. And basically what happens is when an empire from ancient Athens all the way to present-day America is in decline, all right, the psychological pressures, the contortions, economic, political, strategic, begin to build up. And the leaders of these empires are often people born to wealth and privilege and are problematic leaders. Sir Anthony Eden, I mentioned, was one. Donald Trump in our own day is another. All of them are pretty much of that ilk. And they decide to launch their nation on a bold military strike that will either seize new strategically valuable territory or will serve as a display of awesome military power And all that fading imperial authority that is slipping from the fingers of this empowered elite, it will come back. That's the belief. And instead, what happens in almost every instance from ancient Athens, as you mentioned, through Portugal, Spain, Britain, and now the United States, it simply serves, this military misadventure simply serves to accelerate the ongoing imperial decline. And that's where we are today.
But, for example, the 56 British, French, Israeli invasion of the Suez had incredibly devastating collateral damage in a whole different theater, and that was the Cold War. What was happening at the time was there was a rebellion against the Soviets in Hungary. And I spoke some time back with the CIA station chief who negotiated with the Soviet resident, the head of their equivalent of a station chief, who happened to be Yuri Andropov, who became the head of the KGB and later the head of the Soviet Union. Those two were negotiating with the Hungarian rebels for what would have been an early iteration of the Prague Spring. And then as soon as the Brits and the French and the Israelis attacked the Suez, they took the whole Hungarian rebellion story off the headlines, and the Russians reneged on the deals and slaughtered the very guys that they were negotiating with. So do you think that there's going to be other collateral damage already with the Allies? I mean, the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Europeans, they're furious. Australia is running out of gas. I mean, people are just absolutely around the world are just angry as hell at Trump and Netanyahu.
Yeah, what you've hit on, and that's an incredibly appropriate anecdote, and it has parallels to the modern day. And so when you find yourself looking at Suez and you see how it weakened, let's say, the United States, the U.S. intervention, sorry, the British-French intervention in Suez effectively weakened the U.S. position in Hungary, okay? And today there are parallels. The U.S. intervention in Iran is weakening what you might call the Western or U.S. or Allied position everywhere from Ukraine to the Straits of Taiwan and all the way to Korea, okay? So what's going on? There's a phenomenon called geopolitics. And in the theory of geopolitics, the epicenter of global power, okay, where the struggle for hegemony is fought and won or lost, is the Eurasian landmass. And across the Eurasian landmass, in geopolitical theory, there is something called the zone of conflict. And it's a giant arch that extends from Eastern Europe, Poland, through the Middle East, across the northern tier of South Asia, through the Straits of Taiwan, all the way up to the Korean Peninsula. And so what happens is along this zone of conflict, all right, that when pressure is applied in one part of the zone, there's a response in the other part. So what you saw was, on the eastern end of the zone of conflict, there's an uprising by Hungarian nationalists, okay? And then when the British and French, Western powers, commit their forces to a disastrous operation at midpoint on the zone of conflict, well, what happens is the Western position in Hungary is weakened. The Soviets can move their tanks in. They win, we lose, okay? The same thing today, okay? Right now, we are overcommitted at midpoint on this zone of conflict. That is going to allow, in theory, Putin to increase his pressure on Ukraine at the western end of the zone of conflict, and China to increase its pressure on Taiwan in the Straits of Taiwan at the eastern end of the zone of conflict. So this is going to have really important geostrategic ramifications down the road. In a very simple way, when the conflict started, the United States, and this is just a guess because this is highly classified, probably had something like 4,000 interceptor missiles, right? We shot off about 1,000 of them in the first week of the war. Our stocks are diminishing. We had to pull our THAAD interceptor missiles out of South Korea, where the South Koreans had allowed them to be deployed at great diplomatic cost, a lot of pressure from China over that issue. And having done that, we just pulled them right out of South Korea, again, on that zone of conflict. So we weakened the U.S. and the South Korean position. Well, think about how if there is a conflict in the next couple of years in the Straits of Taiwan, how is it likely to be played out? I don't think it's going to be a full-fledged Chinese amphibious invasion of Taiwan. It would be that's a very difficult operation to carry off. The simple thing for the Chinese to do, and this is one of the standard scenarios, is to establish a customs quarantine with aircraft and ships around Taiwan and simply require that all ships that are going to call at Taiwan must call first in a Chinese port and clear customs and then go to Taiwan. All aircraft flying to Taiwan similarly must land first in mainland China, then go to Taiwan. And they'll enforce that with a naval blockade. If the U.S. Navy approaches Taiwan and tries to break that blockade, that will mean an exchange, okay? The Chinese will fire off their thousands of carrier killer missiles trying to sink our aircraft carriers, and the U.S. will try and knock down those carrier killer missiles with their interceptors. And if our stock of interceptors is insufficient for this exchange of missiles, we are not going to save Taiwan. We are not going to send our ships into harm's way because we can't. They'll just be sunk. So again, along this arc of crisis, stretching from Poland in the west to Korea in the east, every strategic error in one place on the arc of crisis manifests itself in strategic problems elsewhere in that arc of crisis. And that's what we're seeing today.
Well, just in the last minute, Al, it looks as if there's a plan for the Marines to go ashore after they pound the Iranian side of the Strait of Hormuz. So this military misadventure, this will make the charge of the Light Brigade look like a picnic.
Yeah, it started off as a sort of 1 week war, quick in and out, and as it's spiraling downward. Diplomatically, the United States position is weakened throughout the conflict. Economically, the pressure on the global economy continues to mount. The ramifications for, let's say, agriculture because of the fertilizers that through the Straits of Hormuz, for the manufacture of semiconductors because of about 1/3 of the world's helium supply, which is a critical component in semiconductor manufacture. That comes from the Straits of Hormuz. Not to mention the oil and natural gas that the dynamic economies of East Asia are dependent upon oil and natural gas from the Straits of Hormuz. China has insulated, but other powers aren't as much. It's causing all kinds of complications and an escalating crisis for the global economy. And, the U.S., tries, okay, our bombing didn't work, so now we're trying a full-blown naval blockade, which only adds to the closure of the Straits of Hormuz, effectively helping the Iranians to maintain their closure. It's bizarre. And now we're going to send troops ashore. This is turning into a classic micro-military misadventure. And we can just watch as the costs mount. We can watch a U.S. global power, U.S. international influence just evaporate. We're coming to the end of the American century, Ian.
Well, Alfred McCoy, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Ian, thank you for having me.
And again, I've been speaking with Alfred McCoy, who holds the Harrington Chair in History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is the author of 24 books, including The Politics of Heroin, In the Shadows of the American Century, and To Govern the Globe. His latest book is Cold War on Five Continents, A Global History of Empire and Espionage. And he has an article at Tom Dispatch, Trump's Iran War is exactly the kind of military misadventure that ends empires. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon and Asher Price. And if you've missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can visit us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we'll include extended interviews searchable by topic and have made it easy for you to sign up for daily email updates that provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. And you can find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media managers, Evan and Luke Susswood, are also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help us sustain this program into the future and assure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back again tomorrow with another background briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
Disappeared by 9:30. Who'll ever know how much she loved them so? That dark night alone in America. A quiet voice singing something to me. An angel song about the home of the brave in this land here under the free. One time, one night in America. And the other became a car skidded into the rain, making the last little one to say, one more light goes out.